All right, and we're live.
Good morning. Good morning. Take a sip of your favorite beverage this morning.
Yes, I've got some oxygen in mine. I drank all my coffee already.
Better than
So, yeah. So I'm excited. This is our first live stream. We're going to talk about some stories in business and some things that we can learn from them as far as business alignment. And the story that I want to talk to you about today is one that it seems like obviously you only have part of the picture from the outside, but it seems like almost everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. And it's JC Penney um, brings in a new CEO about 10, 15 years ago for their fair and square pricing strategy. Um, and it just went terribly.
yeah.
Um, what do you what's your sense of that story there, Chris?
Yeah. I mean, I love, stories because we can learn from them, we can glean from them, and we can borrow wisdom from them. I like the saying that smart people learn from their mistakes, but wise people learn from the mistakes of others. So the goal is that pursuit of wisdom. And there's something to being able to look at, maybe this doesn't work, and maybe I can kind of borrow that. So this is an interesting story for those reasons. And then on the other hand, it's easy to beat somebody up, after they failed. And so I always try to kind of filter it through the lens of, well, what's a charitable interpretation of what we can take from this, without sort of making all of it bad. What?
Yeah. Well, so to get people, anybody who's not aware or maybe has forgotten because it's been over a decade at this point. J.C. Penney at that point, they were, I think, discounting like an average of 50% off of their products because everything would be, they'd kind of have the retail price jacked up, and then everybody would then go and get this good feeling at the register when they're having all these discounts applied and they've got coupons and things like that.
Yeah.
And Ron Johnson comes in, and he was somebody, he had pioneered the genius concept over at Apple and had had some success. And he wanted a more upscale clientele, and he wanted something that I think most of us would agree is pretty uh, a noble intention. He wanted the pricing to be more transparent, um, and instead of having all these deals, you pay what the price is, and the price is just a fair price up front.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, in hindsight, we can see obviously JC Penn is just this legacy company, this almost an American icon. And well, Apple was this innovative tech startup that was trying to, do something completely different, right? And so the context of Apple versus JC Penney was completely different, right? And so I think the first mistake he made is he didn't understand the conditions. He didn't understand the climate of the organization, and to make a change. And studying organizational change, one of the biggest things is that, I think real good change and great change, and change that lasts and change that makes an impact, is kind of transcending and including. um, so you're including the best of what is, so you've got to build on that legacy and understand it in order to really change it well, without making it into this whole new thing that it never was, and is never going to work.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about harmony, and you've got this 7D framework, and people can
Mhm.
check out the website for more information on that. But one of the big things you talk about is just how every dimension of a business has to work in harmony. And
Mhm.
this is such a great example where somebody comes in and it doesn't seem like he really understood the DNA of J.C.
Mhm.
Penney and what made people really like it. It turned out he didn't go out and get the data that he needed, so he just kind of puts all these changes into place, and it turns out that a lot of customers, that just is a big part of what they like. It was something he referred to it as almost being like a drug or an addiction, I think, where it was something that they needed to help wean people off of that. And again, you can kind of see how in some ways like another company could come out and say, we're going to be, you're going to pay a fair price, it's going to be fair and square, you're going to see. And that makes total sense, and we would love that, but you have to do it. You need the data. You need to make sure that it matches with what people think about, and you want to make sure that if something is a source of delight for your customers, which these coupons were, you have to be very cautious in the way that you untangle these knots.
Yeah, yeah, because that could work in the context of Target, right, where the price is the price, and they don't do these mass discounts all the time. Um, but J.C. Penney's customers weren't the Target customers, and that was a completely different context. And so contextualizing change is so important. You can't just put, what worked. You see this with a lot of successful CEOs who had an exit and they sold a business, they built a business, and they, put everything into it, and then they go do another thing, and they try to do all the same things they did in the last thing, and it doesn't work because the context is completely different. And so you have to understand the context. I think, people say content is king. I like to think of context as king. Context is everything, right? The context of the people that are the employees, the culture that we have, the customers that we have, the brand reputation that we have. Like all of that is context, right? And you can't just come in and apply an Apple strategy to a J.C. Penney context. But you see that a lot. You see that a lot with people that hadn't thought through, an approach and a philosophy of change, because this is what we're talking about. All we're talking about here is change, and I think of organizational design as, if you could boil it down to one thing, it's relationship design. You have a relationship with the customers, you have a relationship with the employees, the culture, you have employee relationships with the vendors, you have a brand, even that's a relationship, right, of the kind of trust and promise that you make, and then that's repeatable. And in some sense, he it seems like Ron Johnson didn't have a view of that. um, and it's hard. Organizational change is hard. It's hard to turn a legacy organization around that's suffering and maybe has a culture of disengagement and is performing poorly in their sales. I mean, that is not an easy undertaking at all. But I do like this. But you're right. I think there's a why I like the 7 Ds is because it works in harmony. Like each piece is a part of it, but it's not all of it. And I love the analogy, and I think it's a good one for organizational design, of the farm. The farm is a contained system, and it's not really a contained system because it's part of the greater ecosystem that it lives in and operates in. Um, but it is a microcosm of an organization because you have these different parts that all work together in harmony, right? And I love Wendell Berry, and the philosopher, poet, farmer, um, and have borrowed a lot of his ideas in organizational design. But he has 11 principles, um, of of change that is good, that doesn't have unintended consequences, right? Unintended negative consequences. And one of his principles is that if it's good for part of the farm, it has to be good for all of the farm, because it's a system, right? So if the fertilizer is good for the soil, it has to also be good for the livestock and the environment let's say it's good for the maybe the fertilizer is really good for the plants because it grows healthier plants and bigger, and you can get a higher yield. Well, it has to be good for the chickens too. And a lot of our agriculture is not that way, right? Part is good
Mhm.
for part of the farm, maybe, but it's not good for all the farm. And a lot of our organizational design is the same. It might be good for part of the organization, but is it good for all of the organization? I think any real good change, any positive, um, lasting initiative will be good for all of the organization.
Well, in another, not a perfect analogy, but one that maybe could shed some light on one of Johnson's problems, the way that you talk about uh, all these different variables, some people seem to look at this idea of running a business almost like a chess game where chess players they memorize a bunch of openings and they know about what's going to work because there's only so many variables.
Hmm.
But with a business, if you had to compare it to a game, it would be more like Go or something like that, where there aren't a lot of, you can't just sit there and say, okay, well, I know that this worked in this game, and so I'm going to do this here. You can have a strategy, a broad strategy that you're going to try, but there aren't a lot of things that you can just memorize and apply in business because
Hmm.
there's so many variables, and it's the people, it's the product, everything is going to affect the decisions that you make.
Yeah, the market conditions change.
Mhm.
Everything is dynamic in an organization. Nothing's static. Um, Even if you're running a conveyor belt, that's just producing, bolts over and over and over and over again, that's still a dynamic entity because the competitors might start doing something and underpricing you, right?
Right.
Employees might start getting disgruntled and leaving. You might start losing great, managers. This environment is constantly shifting, right? They're going to raise the rent on your warehouse. I mean, there's all kinds of, and so if we're looking at it as just kind of this contained game, a simple system, then I think we're really missing the reality. It's infinitely
Yeah.
complex. There's infinite complexity to this, which is why I love it because it's always interesting. There's always a challenge. There's always something to think about
Yeah.
and resolve in that.
And so where do you start when you're working with a company and with the understanding that you're working with people at different stages of their business, you're
Mhm.
working with people in different industries, all these variables are even there's even greater variation, I think, when you're dealing with all these different clients. Where do you start when it comes to helping people with some of these issues that you come across?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer over time as I've studied this. There's a reason why most change initiatives do not work in organizations. Let's say it's disengagement, or let's say it's communication, and consultant comes in and puts together a communication plan because this organization is struggling with communication, and there's this really smart consultant that comes in and helps them really come up with a plan on communication, right? And they're going to do this, and they're going to communicate, and even works to embed the plan into the organization, and they're doing it well. 80% of the time when that consultant leaves, that initiative fails, that intervention fails. Well, why? You have to ask yourself, if you're in the business of change and helping organizations get better, it's like if a therapist was failing 80% of the time, which they might be, um, for the most part, you kind of got to ask yourself why. And so that's what I've spent a lot of time studying over the last 10 years, is why are these change initiatives failing, and what can be done about it. And I came across um, a change methodology that really taps into something that I think is both beautiful but also true about humans and relationships and organizations and teams. And it turns out that this methodology has an 87% success rate in long-term change and sustained change. And so, well, you've got to ask yourself, well, what's different about that versus the normal, change initiative that has all the right intentions? These are smart people that have thought about things that are trying to make change that's failing for the most part. 20% is not a passing grade in the school I went to. And so it's not because they're not smart, and it's not because they don't know what they're talking about. So it has to be something else, right? And so this methodology is called appreciative inquiry, and I ended up winning. I went and studied and got a master's degree in change, studying with the kind of the forefather of appreciative inquiry, David Cooper. And so, really, the deeper I got into this, the more I realized that it's not complicated, but it is somewhat counterintuitive to how we go about change. You know, the typical change approach is we identify an issue or a problem, and then we come up with a solution to the problem, and then we implement it, right? Makes sense. It's like, well, we want better communication. We put together the communication plan, and we go tell everybody to use it, right? But it turns out that for a lot of psychological and human kind of behavioral reasons, um, that doesn't work. It only works so long as the boss is looking, or the consultants there kind of making sure that it happens. And appreciative inquiry is a whole reframe of even problems, in the way it views problems, and it's very holistic. And instead of viewing an organization as problems to be solved, it comes from a strengths based perspective of more. David Cooper says there are more mysteries to be understood, right? And you're tapping into the human potential that's there, but it's an intrinsic motivation versus an extrinsic motivation. Top down versus top down, it's very much intrinsic. And so the approach is, um, that change happens at the level of the whole, not at a few people who then go and try to embed change. And and that the more voices and the more stakeholders that are included in the change, that have a voice in what it even is, the more lasting the change is. And not even that, but also that the stakeholders involved, whether it's the vendors, the team members, uh, community members that are impacted, customers, the more voices, these voices, it's not just important to include them because it's nice and the work will be better.
Mhm.
Cooper Ryder strongly believes, and I do too, that they're the ones with the best ideas. They're the ones with the potential that we have to unlock. And so when we approach change as I've got the best ideas and I need to tell you what to do, we're really missing the wisdom of the collective. There's a wisdom that people carry around with them that is different than maybe the wisdom that we have. And when we can tap into that, we can unleash the potential of an organization. A great story that illustrates this in a simple way is the story of the USS Nimholtz. And this was a ship in the Navy, a battleship that was one of the worst performing ships in the Navy, and by every metric. Um, Consistently over budget. Re-enlistment was very low because people didn't want to serve on that ship. Um, they had some of the highest rates of assault um, and harassment. It was a very poor performing ship. um, so they hired a commander to come in. His name was Captain Abershoff, and he came in and they got together. He got together with the crew, and they said, "Well, we want to become the best ship in the Navy. That's our aspiration." They came up with this collective aspiration, and he interviewed personally all 300 plus sailors that were serving on the ship at the time. He talked to them. He sat down and said, "What would you love to see? What are some issues you're encountering? What would be amazing if we could accomplish it?" Um, and he just listened, and they came up, and what he heard was, well, we're doing this really rote work over and over and over again. We're having to change these rusty bolts, and by the time we change the bolts, it's time to start changing them again because it takes so long and it's so cumbersome. And so they're just continually doing this bolt changing, rote activity that's not really anything anybody wants to do over and over
It
again.
sounds like, Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill.
Right, it's a lot like that, or like mowing a huge yard. By the time you're done,
Yeah.
it's time to start over again. And so that was really draining. And he said, okay, well, maybe we could do something about that. And other things where the food is awful. It's just kind of depressing experience to be out here. I mean, it's really hard. We're away from our families for 6 months, and what if we could come up with some better food? And things like, well, we're at sea and we're missing our education. And this was back, before the internet kind of had changed that. And wouldn't it be nice if we could continue our education while we're at sea? And they had all these ideas. And so what they did is got to work on it, and they got to work on it, not he. Right? It's different. Like, they got to work on it. They collectively said, we're going to be the best ship in the Navy, and here are some things we're going to do to try to get there. And they came up with this idea. They did some research, and they found these bolts that would last. They were more expensive, but they would last years and years, and they wouldn't have to continually change them. So they made an investment, and they bought the bolts. And so now that took away care of that problem. They all installed them. And then they started talking with the chefs, and the chefs said, we'd love to make better food, but the ingredients that the Navy gives us are just awful. In fact, we'd love to, like, become better chefs and kind of grow our culinary skills. So they started sending the chef the cooks to school while they were at sea, so they could become chefs. And they bought their own food. It was more expensive. They went and bought their own food, and they started making really delightful meals and really good food at sea. And there were other things they did, like the education thing. They worked with the different ports, like the port of Dubai and the different ports that they would visit, so they could take classes while they were at sea, and then they could go and get testing while they were at the port, so they could continue their education. So everybody was encouraged to continue their education. And you'd hear, well, the boats were expensive and the food was expensive. They were probably way over budget. Um, After 2 years, they became the best performing ship in the Navy. Re-enlistment was higher than any other ship. Assaults and harassment was almost zero. They were so far under budget. They sent I think, over $2 million back to the Navy that year, and so
Wow.
we don't need it. And by every measure, they were one of the handful of best ships in the Navy. And I think that's a great story, because it's the approach that I've adopted, and it's what I strongly believe in. I think that if I hate to throw Ron Johnson under the bus, but if you had taken an approach like that with the customers, with the stakeholders, with the team, involved them in the change, and actually valued their input in the change, then things probably would have gone differently for JCPenney.
Well, so let me tell you that, first of all, it's for me, and if we've got an article on the website if people want to read a little more about it and how the 7D framework applies to it. Uh, but as you say that, I can immediately, it's just, you can think of all these ways that things would have been different. It's the biggest part, instead of it being top down, it would have been engaging the people involved, all stakeholders. And one of the big issues that they had, so Ron Johnson came in there, and I think he hired some COO. Somebody said the culture there was just pathetic, is how they referred to it. And they
Mhm.
talked about how the employees were on were spending time on YouTube and things like that. It was like, I think they said 35% of their time was spent watching videos and stuff. And so this approach, you would have really started with trying to, in some ways, you're fixing that issue while also working on all these other issues. You're engaging them. You can figure out like, okay, seems like maybe this isn't that exciting of a place for you to work. What might make it more exciting? What could we do to make you feel like this is a great place to work? And then they start putting that together and fixing this issue as a team.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the USS Nimholtz had the same problem, and they didn't go in and go, "Y'all are a bunch of lousy sailors, the worst performing ship in the Navy. We gotta shape up, right? We gotta shape up,
Yeah.
engage, do the," they didn't talk about any of that.
They
I mean,
had
that's
and
the
they
way.
actually had it worse because I didn't read about any J.C. Penney staffers getting assaulted. I mean,
Yeah,
that if you
exactly.
think about and the J.C. Penney people, they got to go home at night. So just imagine you're stuck on a boat where people are getting assaulted. You're fixing these screws. I mean, it sounds like being in hell. I mean,
Yeah.
it is. I can't think of a. It's hard to think of situations that would be worse than that. And
Mhm.
it's a great story because if you can do it in that environment, how much more effective would it be in the corporate environment? And and of course, there's a bunch of examples of appreciative inquiry taking companies like Verizon and other ones and just totally turning things around and their growth just exploding.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and I think that, it's counterintuitive. There's a, uh, a farmer, a rancher in Texas, and he, is, you know, he used to produce, beef and cattle just like everybody else, and pump them full of, antibiotics, and spray, you know toxins on the ground to kill the weeds and all the stuff that most people do these days. And he said, with his shift came when he realized that he was going around his ranch looking for things to kill. Imagine that. Like, he was going around his ranch looking for things to kill, problems to get rid of,
Yeah,
weeds, disease, all of the things. And he saw his job as primarily a killer at the end of the day. And he realized it was a big shift for him when he realized that, what if I was walking around thinking about what to give life to, what to elevate, what to bring out, the potential of the earth, the potential of the cattle. And see, he completely shifted to sustainable agriculture, and it's a complete paradigm shift. It's like turning the world upside down, because you're kind of, oftentimes as leaders we think of ourselves as the chief problem solver, right? And so therefore we go around looking for problems
yeah,
to squash, and we wonder why we're playing whack-a-mole with problems. We wonder why, there's always a new weed, there's always a new problem to solve. What if we were going around looking for the best of what is, so that we could bring it out and cultivate it, and what was life-giving, and what
yeah,
was and when we do that, the problems take care of themselves. It's almost like magic.
yeah,
It's not easy, because we have a bias towards the negative. It's almost default to go in that mode. And I think that's why appreciative inquiry is so powerful. That appreciative frame, from problem solving to elevating what is good and life-giving and energizing, that builds momentum, that builds
yeah.
human capacity, that unleashes human capacity. And I often wonder why everybody doesn't do that and everybody doesn't love that. And I think it's because of that kind of our natural instinct is we think that to do that is to avoid the problems. And so I can't avoid problems, right? And what I tell people over and over is not a problem avoidance. It's just how the problems get solved. Captain Abrashov didn't avoid the problems, but the way he went about solving them was not to look at them alone, but it was look at the potential. He saw that the bolts was a problem, but what they saw was potential to change that. He saw that the food was a problem. It wasn't avoidance of the problem, but it's all in how you go about it.
Yeah. Well, so I know, so we're coming up to the end here of our first episode, and I'm really excited. This has been a great conversation, and if people are interested in learning more of this, they need to follow you and make sure that they do not miss a stream. But I know you've been working on this event, and it's tomorrow, and there are still a few seats left. So for any owners or executives out there, could you tell them a little bit about this event and kind of what you've got planned for tomorrow?
Yeah, so we're going to be getting together with a group of owners. I think there's only room for about 20. So we're probably pretty close to capacity, but we might have one or two more. Um, and we're going to have this type of conversation. We're going to really talk about why purpose is an advantage, and purpose driven companies outperform um, good to great companies. And so I'm going to talk about what Jim Collins missed in Good to Great and how that comes alive. We're going to have a real story of a business that's leading with that. I'm going to talk with a CEO and his one of his executives about how that has come to life in their organization and changed really everything from their customer relationships to their team to the owner's peace of mind to how they have conflict and the kinds of results that they're driving. So, be a great conversation, great workshop about how you can think of purpose in your own context, really helping you identify that. And so, yeah, and
Awesome.
really more of this in terms of
Yeah.
this why this approach is powerful.
And I will throw a link up there for people to register if they want to attend that. So thank you, Chris, and we will see